We're going to take a look back now at some of the top international stories of 2011. They include the rise of people power, as some say, from the Middle East to Wall Street, the devastating earthquake and tsunami in Japan, and the dramatic takedown of two of the most ruthless enemies to America.
Yes, and here to talk about those events and more is Time Magazine's Deputy International Editor, Bobby Ghosh. Great to have you with us. Good morning, Bobby.
Good morning.
So, I mean, Jeff called it people power. You see the little guy becoming very big in 2011, and that is what tops your list from the Arab Spring to now you see protests here in the United States, in Russia. Why does that top your list?
Well, I think it's because this is something we have not seen in our lifetimes. There was the fall of communism in 1989, but it wasn't as international as this, that people right across the world basically stood up and said, enough. We're not going to take the certainties that our parents' generation imposed on us. We're not going to put up with dictatorships. We're not going to put up with unfair economic arrangements where a tiny minority of people get the biggest part of the pie and the rest of us don't. And so people everywhere basically decided this was the year that they were going to stand up to this. And they did this using new technology as tools to organize themselves, Facebook, social networks, and they were inspired by each other. So you go to Zuccotti Park and people are talking about Tahrir Square in Egypt, and you go to Tahrir Square and people are talking about what's going on in the Red Square in Moscow. They were able to influence each other and feed off of each other, and we've not seen that.
Do you lump that together, though, Bobby, or is it fair to make a distinction between what's happening in the Middle East and the Occupy Wall Street protesters?
Well, look, in the Middle East, people are putting their lives on the line, right, and the lives of their families. There's a fear that if things go wrong, men in dark vans will come and take away their wives and children and never be seen again. People are literally dying for this cause. So there is a difference between that and what we see in Zuccotti Park. But the important thing is they're talking to each other, and they're learning from each other. And we were in Tahrir Square a couple of weeks ago, and people there are not saying, well, Zuccotti Park, that's not the same thing. They're actually quite excited by the fact that this is an international movement almost.
Osama bin Laden died in May. World repercussions that followed over the months after were significant, to say the least.
Well, yes, and especially because it comes after the Arab Spring. Yep. Osama bin Laden dies and there's no Arab Spring, that's one story. That's one man dying, the jihad continues. But the jihad was actually killed by the Arab Spring, because the Arab Spring showed young Arabs that there was another way by which they could right the injustices of their life, and that Osama's way was not the right way. So Osama bin Ladenism was killed before bin Laden was killed. And both of those events happened this year. That is historic.
This year also got off to a really shaky start in terms of the earthquake that occurred in Japan in March, and then the ensuing tsunami that caused major ripple effects around the globe. That stands out to you. What elements of it do you think were the most significant for 2011?
Well, I've spent a lot of time in Japan, and it's a country that's used to big natural disasters, especially earthquakes and tsunamis. By themselves, the natural disasters were big, but if it hadn't been for the nuclear fallout that came afterwards, that plant in Fukushima that basically nearly melted down.
Which they're still dealing with now.
And a year later, they're still dealing with it. That is what struck me, because that showed us a side of Japan that we're not used to. We think of Japan as this incredibly efficient country where people rally together when the government says they should, and they do the right thing. But to know that there was a plant there that was so badly managed, and then when this disaster happened, they essentially tried to cover it up. That's not what we expect from Japan, and that was a big shocker for me.
Muammar Gaddafi in Libya held on for too long. We saw this dramatic video of him then being killed, essentially, on camera. What's next for Libya?
Well, Libya is in a tricky transition phase now. Now if you like, the hard part begins in bargaining between all the different tribes and who gets how much responsibility, who gets how much authority. But the thing to keep in mind about Libya is that they've got a tiny population and less than 7 million people. They've got huge amounts of oil. They're actually a very highly educated society. They're very high education standards there. It was the one thing that Gaddafi got right. So they have the intellectual capital and they have the money to get this right. all that remains, and I'm not trying to make this a small thing, but all that remains is the political arrangement that they can come to now. And the world is ready to help, just as the world was ready to help them get rid of Gaddafi. The Europeans in particular are offering to help, the United Nations. So I'm a little optimistic about Libya in the future.
Europe's been facing its own crisis this year, though.
Yeah. Much less optimistic about Europe. I mean, this was a crisis that was many years in the coming. You had two Europes. You had Greeks and Italians and Spaniards who were spending the money essentially that the Germans and the French were making. And it had to come to this. At some point, the Germans were going to say, we're not going to keep financing your luxurious lifestyle. And the Greek debt, which was the sort of trigger for all of this to happen. The Europeans are now trying to find a new arrangement, but the real problem is that you have one half of Europe that is wealthy, that is willing to work hard and do the right thing, and you have another half of Europe that's essentially feeding off of the first half, and that can't survive.
Bobby Ghosh, thank you. We appreciate it.
Good to see you. Happy New Year.
Happy
Anytime.
New Year.
Same to you.